If you are new to milling flour at home, or if you're just learning about milling flour at home, you might be wondering, how do I use fresh milled flour in place of all-purpose? And the good news is, it's a super simple conversion. And today I'm going to share with you 3 steps for really easily swapping out your all-purpose flour for fresh milled. When I first started milling flour at home, I kept seeing people say online things like, using fresh milled flour is a totally different experience. There's a huge learning curve. And it's true, there is a little bit of a learning curve, but with a few simple steps, it really is an easy transition moving from all-purpose flour or store-bought flour to fresh milled. Before we get going, if you want more information about the type of mill I use, how to make sourdough with fresh milled flour, or just some general information about using fresh milled flour, check out the description box because I have a number of links for videos and blog posts that have recipes, tutorials, and more. So you can check those out there. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. When you are converting from all-purpose flour to fresh milled flour, the first thing I recommend doing is converting your recipe from volume to grams. And if you're in the US like I am, that can be a little bit tedious and a little bit daunting because most of our recipes are in cups. But there are a number of reasons why weighing in grams is actually a lot easier in baking in general, but also especially for fresh milled flour. Across the board in baking, one of the reasons why weighing your ingredients in grams is better is because it is more precise and repeatable. So one of the issues that we run into when we are measuring things, say in cups, is that it's not super precise. It depends on how the flour is milled, how coarse or how fine it is. It depends on how compact it is. So a cup of flour can vary depending on the type of flour you're using, the humidity of the day, how tightly you packed it into the cup. So it's not really precise or repeatable. But when you measure in grams, 100 grams of flour is always 100 grams of flour. If you're measuring wheat berries in cups, for example, and you put 1 cup of wheat berries into your mill, you don't get a cup of flour. Depending on the coarseness and depending on the type of wheat berry you're milling, you could end up with 2-3 cups of flour. So it's really hard to judge how much to mill if you're using cup measurements and not grams. The variations in coarseness or how it settles in cups changes the actual measurement. But when you weigh 100 grams of wheat berries and you run it through your mill, what you have, no matter the coarseness, no matter how tightly it's packed, is 100 grams of flour. I'm going to share a little bit more about some super precise conversions in just a minute. But for now, what you really need to know is that 1 cup of store-bought all-purpose flour in general is about 120 grams. So when your recipe calls for, say, 1 cup of all-purpose flour, you need 120 grams of wheat berries. Or if it calls for 2 cups of all-purpose flour, you need 240 grams of wheat berries. But it's not always a one-to-one conversion, and I'm going to share more about how to figure out that conversion in just a minute. Don't let it intimidate you. I have the absolute easiest solution for you. But first, we need to talk about the second part of how to convert all-purpose flour to fresh milled, and that is understanding the type of wheat you are using. It isn't quite as simple as a one-to-one conversion because different types of wheat berries have different qualities about them. So we have to take that into consideration when we are converting from all-purpose to fresh milled. So there are 2 types of wheat that we use, soft wheat and hard wheat. So let's talk about soft wheat first. Soft wheat is soft. It has a lower protein content and it has more moisture. So generally you would use soft wheat berries for things like pastries, sweet breads, muffins, cookies, things that don't need a lot of gluten development. And hard wheat is, well, hard. It has more protein content and it has less moisture. This is the wheat berry you would use for things like sourdough bread, sandwich bread, cinnamon rolls, those sorts of things that do need some gluten structure to them. So these 2 types of wheat are used for different types of baking. And just as a side note, if you're not sure which type of wheat you want to get, I would always recommend starting with the hard white wheat just to begin with. It is the easiest and most versatile wheat to use. You can use it across the board for just about anything. I think that in time you would find that having a soft wheat and a hard wheat is a little bit better if you want to do things like pastries and breads. But if you have to pick one, I would pick a hard white wheat. But with that said, when we are using soft or hard wheat, the conversion does change because of the moisture content. So if you recall just a moment ago, I said that soft wheat has a higher moisture content, and it has a higher moisture content than the store-bought all-purpose flour that most of us are used to. So that means when we are converting from all-purpose flour to fresh milled soft wheat, we have to use more fresh milled soft wheat to account for that moisture. So in general, when we are converting then from all-purpose flour to a fresh milled soft wheat, we need to add about a quarter cup or 30 grams more per cup of all-purpose flour. So if your recipe calls for 1 cup of all-purpose flour and you are using fresh milled soft wheat, you would then use either 1¼ cup of flour, or more precisely 150 grams of flour. Because remember, 120 grams of flour is 1 cup, and then an extra 30 grams, the extra quarter cup, would equal 150 grams. Or let's say your recipe calls for 2 cups of all-purpose flour. You would use 2½ cups of fresh milled soft wheat, or more precisely 300 grams. The conversion for hard wheat is actually a little bit easier. For the most part, you can mill hard wheat and use a 1-to-1 ratio. So if it calls for 1 cup of all-purpose flour, you could use 1 cup of fresh milled hard wheat. So that's a little bit easier in that sense. Sometimes, depending on what you're making and just the wheat itself, you might need to add a little bit extra hydration. But it is easier because the conversion for the flour itself is a 1-to-1 ratio. So if your recipe calls for 1 cup of all-purpose flour and you're using hard wheat, you could use 1 cup of fresh milled hard wheat, or 120 grams, and then adjusting the hydration as needed along the way. Now, over on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com, I have a free printable conversion chart for soft and hard wheat. So on this chart, I have all the conversions in cups and grams that you need from a quarter cup all the way to 5 cups of flour. And it'll show you that conversion for soft wheat and hard wheat, plus a few tips along the way. So if you want to skip the conversion rigmarole altogether, just go down to the description box and click the link for the printable chart, print it out, stick it in your pantry door, stick it on your fridge, and you don't ever really have to think about it again. But one of the things that I really want to emphasize here, no matter what type of wheat you're using, is that you always have to pay attention to the quality of your dough or your batter. Because even though we can have these conversions, nothing is ever 100% precise. Every type of wheat is different. It depends on how much rain the wheat received while it was growing. It depends on your environment and your humidity. There are a lot of different factors that determine the overall moisture content of the wheat. So that means even if you're following this conversion chart to a T, you might need a little more flour, you might need a little less, you might have to add a little more hydration or a little bit less. And so the real thing that I want to emphasize here is experience. Practice. See what works and see what doesn't. If you are familiar with baking with all-purpose flour, what you're really looking for here is for the quality of your batter or your dough to be the same. The texture might be a little bit different because fresh milled flour is often a little more coarse, especially if you're leaving all the bran and germ in there. So it might feel a little more granular than what you're used to. But in terms of the hydration and how the dough feels and the stickiness, for example, we're really looking for the same qualities. So now that we have the whole conversion part down, I do have a few tips that might help along the way. So number one, if you are brand new to milling flour, I recommend starting small. Take your recipe and just replace 50% of the all-purpose flour with fresh milled. That way you can just see how the texture feels, you can see how the hydration changes, and it gives you just a little bit of an idea of what's going on. Then the next time you make a recipe, maybe add in 75% fresh milled flour. So that way you're not just, cold turkey switching to fresh milled flour. I mean, you can do that if you want to. That's actually what I did. That's totally fine if that's what you want to do. But if you're a little unsure of the changes to make and what you're looking for, an incremental approach might be helpful. Number two, as I've mentioned, and I will probably mention in every video about making anything with flour, adjust as needed. There are a lot of factors that come into play with your dough and batter hydration, consistency, and quality. So you could measure all of this to a T and then still need to make some adjustments. So pay attention to the quality of your dough, pay attention to the quality of the batter, and make adjustments as you go. Number three, and this is for those of you who are making bread with fresh milled flour, you're probably going to knead it a little bit longer than you're used to. All-purpose flour doesn't take a tremendous amount of kneading, especially if you're using a stand mixer, but fresh milled flour, it takes a little bit longer for that gluten to develop. So anticipate having to spend a little more time kneading it by hand or keeping it in the stand mixer a little bit longer. Just like with store-bought flour, what you're aiming for is a smooth dough that's slightly tacky and that passes the window pane test. If you're not sure what the window pane test is, check the description box because I have a blog tutorial and a video tutorial that shows you how to do that. I've seen a lot of people online say that their fresh milled flour dough never passes the window pane test. but it can definitely pass the window pane test with the right hydration and the right amount of kneading. Tip number 4 or 5, 4, I'm not sure which one we're on, but the next tip, if you are mixing your fresh milled flour ingredients in a stand mixer, I recommend first using the paddle attachment. So that flour, it takes a while for it to absorb the water. And so if you just stick your dough hook on there and you try to get that dough to come together with the dough hook, it's gonna be kind of like a sloppy mess. It's gonna be really hard for it to come together. So what I recommend doing is putting your ingredients in the stand mixer if that's what you're using, use the paddle attachment to combine them, and then you can switch to your dough hook when you're ready. But with that said, that kind of leads me into my next point. When you are using fresh milled flour, particularly fresh milled hard wheat, it is very helpful to let your dough rest for like 30 minutes, all the way up to a couple of hours. And that is because that flour needs to absorb the water. So when you first combine the ingredients, your dough is probably gonna look like a sloppy mess. You're gonna be like, this is never gonna work. But if you mix it together and let it rest for a while, what you'll find when you come back is a dough that is much more combined and much more workable. This hasn't been so much of an issue for me when using soft wheat because it does have more moisture in it. So giving it time to autolyze like that doesn't really, in my experience, make much of a difference. Maybe your experience has been different, and if so, let me know how that goes in the comments because I'm always curious. But in my experience, what has been helpful when using hard wheat is to combine the ingredients, let it sit for about 30 to 45 minutes, even up to an hour, knead everything, make any adjustments so it is the right consistency, and then finish the process. Now, sourdough breads and high hydration breads, they're gonna feel pretty sticky. But I found, for example, when I make a regular no-knead sourdough, those first few stretch and folds are kind of like a sticky mess. But after like 4 or 5 hours of that dough sitting around, it's a really nice, smooth dough. Okay, so let's talk about some specific types of baking and how to convert from all-purpose to fresh milled flour. So let's start with baking bread. When you are baking bread, whether it's sourdough like I bake all the time, or if it's using a regular commercial yeast, you really want to use a hard wheat. You can use a hard red wheat, you can use hard white wheat, you can use kamut, or any combination thereof. In fact, one of my favorite combinations right now is half hard white wheat and half kamut. It's delicious, it's super mild, and I recommend trying it if you haven't already. But when you're converting from all-purpose to fresh milled flour for bread, it is generally a 1-to-1 ratio. But you want to increase the hydration by about 5% or so. It's really up to you what works for you, and it's worth experimenting. I found that for like a rustic no-knead sourdough, I just need a little bit extra water, but for a sandwich bread, I like to add in an extra egg and just like a tablespoon or so more of honey. As I mentioned, when you're making bread, you want to let that flour autolyze for at least 30 to 45 minutes so it can absorb the moisture. But one of the things that you really should anticipate when switching from all-purpose flour to fresh milled is your bread will probably have a tighter crumb. This is really normal. When you are making bread with fresh milled flour, it will be a little bit denser, the holes will be a little bit smaller, and that is totally normal. Remember, fresh milled flour is not the same as all-purpose flour. They are two different types of flours. So you can't expect to get the exact same results with fresh milled flour as you would all-purpose. If you find that fresh milled flour bread is just a little bit too dense and a little too earthy for you, you can always add in some all-purpose flour or bread flour and do a half and half if that suits you better. Okay, let's talk about making pastries, things like cookies and cakes and sweetbreads, those sorts of things. So when you are making these types of baked goods, you want to use a soft wheat, and we are increasing by about a 1/4 cup or 30 grams per cup of flour in the recipe. Now, just in the same way as I was talking about with making bread, even your pastries will be a little more dense with fresh milled wheat because it has the bran and the germ in it. If you're finding that you don't like that dense texture in your cookies and brownies, for example, you can always sift the flour to remove the bran and the germ. And in fact, you can do that when baking bread too, but here's the issue with sifting flour to remove the bran and germ. It might make a lighter, fluffier baked good, but you're also removing the most nutritious parts of the flour. When you mill wheat berries, all 3 parts of the wheat berries are included in the flour: the endosperm, bran, and germ. And the 3 of those combined create a 100% whole grain flour. So sifting it does remove that nutrition. However, it really depends on what your goals are. If your goals are to have 100% whole grain nutrition, I recommend not sifting your flour. If your goal is to have a lighter, fluffier baked good, then sift it. Remember, you can do whatever you want. The other thing I want to mention about converting from all-purpose to fresh milled for pastries is that it does have a slightly earthier, nuttier flavor. So it doesn't have that really light, soft flavor of all-purpose. It's very delicious. It can take a little bit of adjusting to, but if you feel that you really want to highlight the sweetness and not the earthiness of fresh milled flour, I would recommend increasing the sweetener in your recipe just a little bit. And again, you can experiment with this. I found that I don't really want to increase the sweetener. I've seen a lot of fresh milled recipes. They have like a lot of sugar because they're trying to hide that flavor, and then it ends up for me being too sweet. But it's just a matter of personal preference. So after trying the recipe 1 or 2 times, you can make adjustments as needed. So I also want to talk about pasta. So of course this isn't actually baking, but a lot of people like to make pasta with fresh milled flour, and it is very delicious, by the way. It has so much flavor. When making pasta with fresh milled flour, I recommend using Seminola or Durham wheat berries. Really, you can use any hard wheat berry that you have, but these are sort of the classic ones for pasta. The process for making pasta with fresh milled flour is the same as making pasta with all-purpose flour, but there is that hydration issue because it is a hard wheat generally that we're using to make pasta. So I recommend using a little bit more liquid, and one thing you can do when you are making pasta is take your flour and your water, combine it, and let it sit for 30 to 60 minutes, and then follow the rest of your pasta making process, because you really need that flour to absorb some of that moisture. It can be a little bit tricky to figure out the hydration for a pasta if you don't do that, because the flour needs time. When we're making bread, often there is a lot of waiting period and we're kneading things for a while in the stand mixer. So we have like more time to figure out what the hydration is. But with pasta, often we're just used to like kneading it and then letting it rest. This time, I think the easiest thing to do to get the quality that most of us want out of pasta is to combine the flour and water, let it rest, then follow the rest of your recipe and proceed as usual and adjusting as needed. Now, one of the things across the board, no matter what you're making with fresh milled flour, that I do recommend anticipating is that it will go bad faster. So you'll probably find that your fresh milled baked goods, your fresh milled pasta, they don't last quite as long. In fact, I was kind of surprised how quickly my sourdough bread got moldy. The first few times I made it, we didn't even get through it because it got moldy so fast. So anticipate that. If you know that you're gonna make a loaf of bread, but it takes your family a week to get through it, I would recommend making it, slicing it, and freezing it. Or if you know that you were going to make homemade pasta with fresh milled flour, make as much as you're gonna eat, cook it, or freeze your dough for later use. Now, no matter what you're making, whether it's bread, pastries, or pasta with fresh milled flour, you don't really need to change the baking or cooking time that much. In general, you can use the same temperature and same time as your regular recipe. But if you do increase the hydration of your bread dough, for example, you might need to bake it a little bit longer to account for that. But for the most part, it is about the same. So use your regular baking temperature, set it for the regular time, and then adjust as needed. I know it can feel a little bit intimidating switching from all-purpose flour to fresh milled flour, but really with just this conversion and a few tips and tricks, which you now have, you can turn all of your favorite all-purpose recipes into fresh milled flour recipes. Remember, baking is an art and a science. It takes a little bit of creativity and a whole lot of experimenting to get exactly what you want. So enjoy the process, make your recipes, tweak them when you need to, and enjoy every last bite of your fresh milled goods. Don't forget to head over to my blog at moonandmagnolia.com to get that free printable fresh milled flour conversion chart. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Thanks so much for stopping by today, and I'll see you again next time.